Hello, how are you doing? Thank you for being here in this session. Dr. Kunal Kothari is going to moderate, so I'll leave the floor to you and I'll be here in case you need anything. And we'll have
Hey,
questions and answers at the end. So you can start writing your questions in the chat or keep them for the end. Okay?
okay, great. Hello, everybody. Good evening. I mean, good afternoon for everybody. It's actually nighttime for me. So welcome, Dimitris Strogos, and all the attendant people in attendance. I'd like to introduce Dr. Stroikos. He's the head of the space policy program at the London School of Economics Ideas, and that he teaches at the Department of International Relations. He's also the editor of Space Policy, an international journal, and his research has appeared in such publications as Astropolitics, India Review, International Politics, Journal of Contemporary China, Oxford Research Encyclopedia, International Studies, the Review of International Studies, and Space Policy. He's also co-edited the forthcoming book on Rising Power, Limited Influence. It's a great pleasure to have him for the talk. I'll leave it up to him to start his presentation.
Thank you very much, Kunal. It's great to be here. So I decided to give a short presentation about the connections between the study of space policy and international relations as a discipline, as a distinct discipline, at least in the UK. I know that in the United States is more like a sort of a subfield of political science. But I think it's extremely important to do so. And I will elaborate a bit more on that. Well, obviously, space policy is by default an interdisciplinary endeavor. And at the same time, space policy has always been at the intersection of the domestic and the international. And as such, I think it feels very nicely within the purview of international relations as a discipline or a subdiscipline, if you like. And that's extremely important today, not least because space activities are becoming more and more internationalized. So my presentation, for those of you who are interested in the study of space politics and policy from an international relations theory perspective, builds on this entry article that I published. I was commissioned to write for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia that Kunal mentioned before. And that was the first systematic attempt to map how and in what ways experts have tried to apply international relations theories to the study of space. And I will try to highlight here some of these key aspects of this literature. I would argue, building on this entry piece, that the study of the international politics of space remains rather descriptive and under-theorized. But at the same time, however, there is a growing literature that explores certain aspects of space activities from an international relations theory perspective. Of course, this is not a surprise given the surge in the increased interest in space for civilian, military, and commercial purposes. So there is an emerging and vibrant multidisciplinary subfield of IR, but that stands for international relations as a discipline, but there is more to be done. So also based on my experience as the editor of the oldest journal in the field called Space Policy, since 2019, we're receiving a lot of submissions now that make the links with international relations theory. And I think this is very important also in the context of space education, one of the main themes of this conference. So I would argue those who are interested to delve into the study of space policy and international relations theory, it has a lot to say about space activities. At the same time, though, there are some caveats. I would argue that space is still not taken seriously within the discipline of international relations. That's at least my expertise. But this shouldn't prevent us as space policy experts to try to bring insights from international relations theory. And in doing so, I will also make the case for pluralism in the study of space policy. There are many different theories. The challenge then is how we can try to combine them not least because the study of space policy has been mainly, if you like, been shaped by 1-2 core approaches, and more needs to be done, especially in the context of feminism, gender, and post-colonial studies. I think that's extremely important because it helps us to go beyond Eurocentrism, which is still very much embedded in the study of space policy. So I'll start with realism. And again, one key takeaway here for those who don't have a background, realists claim that they go back to Thucydides, Sun Tzu, Machiavelli. It is associated with this tradition of thought known as realpolitik. The focus is on power dynamics and state competition. And in this context, it has a lot to say about the return of great power competition in space, the role of states as the main actors in space, not least because space has this very important strategic dimension. But at the same time, and that's one of the first things to highlight here based on my experience, is that realism is not a single coherent theory. For some reason, even when we talk about realism, we tend to associate it with a very specific strand of realist thought, associated with the scholar John Mearsheimer, but it's more sophisticated than that sort of realism. We have classical realism, then we have structural realism. Within structural realism, we have defensive and offensive realists. Again, the point here is not to highlight that, to elaborate in some detail. Of course, I would be happy to discuss some of those nuances later on in the Q&A. But we have to be careful about what sort of realism we're engaging with, because in the end of the day, realists can reach different conclusions about state behavior and the international politics of space. I also found in my research very interesting the concept of the security dilemma, which has been associated mainly with realism. This refers to a situation in which a state's effort to enhance its own security through military means has the effect of decreasing the perceived security of its competitor, setting in motion a sequence of action-reaction. And I think this concept of the security dilemma has a lot to say with regards to US-China space relations today. Of course, realists have a lot to say about the militarization and weaponization of space, the centrality of the states as the main actors in the politics of space and space policy. And also they have a lot to say about the Cold War and so on. So a very sophisticated theory, but we have to be careful about what sort of realism we're engaging with here. It's not one realism, there are many realisms. Another interesting approach is liberalism, right? In contrast to realists, liberals highlight the role of cooperation, and in doing so, they focus on international organizations, UN, COMPUOS, multilateralism, the role of international treaties, and of course, they're interested in the regime, the international regime for space activities. The key takeaway here is that, of course, competition has been a key aspect of the space age from its beginnings, right? But cooperation was also a very important aspect of the space age from the beginning. After all, it's worth remembering that Sputnik was launched within the context of the International Geophysical Year, a very important global scientific event. So again, the argument here would be, well, first, there are many liberal strands of thought. So again, we have to be careful about, what kind of liberalism we're engaging with, but also that it has a lot to say, especially in today's context. There is a prevailing narrative about great power competition, again, especially in the context of China and the US, but there is so much cooperation taking place as well. And this is not between states, but also in the context of non-state actors. There is also a lot of regional activities taking place. This is not only about Europe and the European Space Agency. I'm sure you're all familiar with how we're seeing the establishment of regional platforms for cooperation in Africa, the Gulf states, Latin America, and of course, Asia is hosting a few important institutions that promote the cooperation of space. And I found a very interesting book here that highlights the importance of liberalism. This is by Whitman Cobb, called Privatizing Peace. She puts forward the commercial space peace thesis. It's the idea that there is a growing role of private actors together with the growing dependence on the global economy on space-based assets help create powerful economic disincentives for conflict in space. And this is a very good book that highlights the merits of a liberal approach to space policy and the global politics of space. And this is just a visualization of the many components of the outer space regime. And moving on, so for many, many years, realism and liberalism were the core, if you like, approaches to international relations. And of course, this was reflected in the literature on space. But we have also seen the so-called constructivist turn in the late 1980s, early 1990s, which is about the social construction of space. Again, this is not a theory. This is more an approach with different variants, and that's again something we have to keep in mind. But underpinning those different strands is a shared commitment to the social dimensions of global politics. And this involves taking into consideration the sources of change through interaction, the role of ideas and identity in shaping national interests, and how norms constrain power. There have been important books and works in this regard, but I would argue here in particular that constructivist insights have been influential in shaping space policy practice. This has been evident in debates about and efforts to establish code of conducts in space, and the more recent, of course, efforts within the United Nations with the open-ended working group, which focused on establishing norms for responsible behavior in space. So this serves to highlight the links between practice and theory here, how constructivism has a lot to say in this regard. Another example here that I would highlight is, for example, how it is China's great power identity as the key driver behind its human spaceflight program as an important source of status marker, right? The same can also be said about India. In many ways, there was this emphasis on socioeconomic development since the 60s, 70s, but now we are seeing this shift towards human spaceflight, space exploration. Yesterday, the Indian government just announced, that they will move on. It's actually, they improved the establishment of a space station, their own space station. And this is about the social dimensions of, of global politics, whereas realists would emphasize the material sources of power, especially military power, as the currency that matters in global politics. Constructivism highlights also this social dimension, like in the context of recognition, the role of history, the role of identity. So there have been, again, in that context, important works. Constructivism also challenges this deterministic idea that war in space is inevitable. If space is what states make out of it, then there's nothing inevitable about that. There is a great work done by James Clay Maltz, who has highlighted those dimensions there in his book, The Politics of Space Security, now in its 3rd edition. And of course, those are considered to be the 3 core approaches, but I would argue that we need more of critical approaches. Some work has been done from critical theory, post-structuralism, and Marxist approaches. This is also linked to critical geopolitics and critical geography. And we're seeing a lot of, in fact, works of late that they try to deconstruct the hegemonic ideology of free market, what happens in the context of the privatization and commercialization of space exploration and space travel. Who benefits from that, right? It's about reproducing social inequalities, for example. It's about then where you come from and where you sit within this broader evolving dynamics of space politics. Then feminism and gender studies, I think that they have a lot to say. There have been some studies from other sort of disciplines, but I would argue that almost every facet of the international politics of space is gendered. And we're only now begun to have some works on space related to space that highlight the role of gender hierarchies, for example. Where are the women in the space sector? Where are the women in the space policy decision-making apparatus? So again, the key takeaway here is that there is much scope for feminist contributions to the study of the international politics of space. We just published an article in the journal on the United States and a feminist space policy approach. So there is a new generation of scholars that is more interested in these very interesting approaches. And related to this is also post-colonial perspectives. Post-colonial perspectives highlight the role of culture, race, racism, and the enduring legacies of colonialism and empire, and how they still shapes visions of space exploration, for example. Those perspectives also serve to highlight the perennial issue of justice or injustice in space, and concerns for development, the existing north-south divide in space, the issue of Eurocentrism on understanding space activities. India does things different in space, and this reflects the role of history, the legacy of colonialism, and many, many other things, right? We don't try to essentialize here something like that. But when we talk about the history of the space age, and I mentioned that because we had this discussion with Kunal at the beginning, since you are now based in India today, Indians have been pioneering the use of space for socioeconomic development, teleeducation, telemedicine. Vikram Sarabhai was a pioneer in this regard, but we tend to neglect that aspect, right? And I would argue it worked quite well for India, you know, tailoring space for the needs of what was then a developing country. So it's about bringing into also the agency of non-Western actors. And I think that matters more than ever, as we are seeing increasing interest of space. Well, India now is an emerging space power anyways. China is already an established space power. But we're seeing even smaller states within the global South interested in space, investing in space for socioeconomic development. I mentioned Africa before. There is a lot of interest in utilizing space. So post-colonial perspectives also serve to highlight unequal power relations and how hierarchies remain a key feature of the international politics of space. So again, this is an area where we need more people to working on on space policy and international relations. And then so far, and I will end with that, IR theories tend to be treated as paradigms, as silos, if you like, that they don't speak to each other. They're treated as distinctive and self-contained, right? But this has been changing as we need to go beyond those sort of paradigms by combining different theories, approaches, and logics embedded in these IR theory discussions. And my work has been inspired by that. So in a recent article, which is open access if you're interested, about China and India's anti-satellite tests, I tried to combine structural imperatives, that is realism, domestic influences. I looked at the role of bureaucratic politics, for example, and domestic political considerations. And also from a constructivist point of view, I highlighted the role of history and identity, as they also bring important insights into understanding what drives anti-satellite tests. But this should not be confined only to these anti-satellite tests. So there is scope for that as well. There's nothing that prevents us only to use realism, constructivism, or domestic politics. The other approaches can be combined, and that is already happening. Not least because the idea of analytical eclecticism and pluralism here is that you have a puzzle-driven research, rather than you start with, you know, with a presumption about what theory as an ideology sort of is going to work, and then I'll try to provide the analysis. And I think it's very useful in this regard. So just to conclude here, the study of space policy is by default multidisciplinary, and the same also applies to international relations as a discipline or as a subdiscipline, if you like. So there are many linkages there and many connections. So yes, the study of space from IR remains under-theorized and underutilized, but nevertheless, this I think tells more about institutions and academia rather than about the utility of our theory. And I think it has a lot of important insights to bring into the study of space policy, space exploration, and space governance. But at the same time, that's my presentation is a call for pluralism and eclecticism, and a call for trying to go beyond Eurocentrism by incorporating the agency of non-Western actors. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Dimitrios. That was an excellent presentation and a very, very insightful talk. I think we have some questions, which I think we already have some of the questions. So there's one question from Philip McMurray. He's stating about the deteriorating relations between the US, China, and Russia. And he's talking about how likely is the spillover into space policy is going to happen, like in terms of ignoring things like outer space treaty and militarizing a moon base. So what diplomatic approaches can be taken to reverse it?
Well, I'm just working on that, to be honest. There are too many layers to that, right? Again, going back to my presentation and, taking into consideration the context of the Cold War, right? It's worth remembering that both the Americans and the Soviets at the beginning of the space age, they tested, they even detonated nuclear weapons in high altitudes. But it was a process of learning that led them to realize that, okay, you know what, that doesn't make a lot of sense because it creates a lot of space debris, radiation belt, and this messes up with our own satellites. At the same time, this also meant that both the Soviets and the Americans began to understand the importance, the benefits that can accrue from the use of space assets for military applications, such as reconnaissance, early warning systems, communications. But that was different from turning space as an actual battlefield. So it was this combination of factors that led both the Soviets and the Americans to treat space as a sort of a collective good for the most part of the Cold War. And this, I mean, we shouldn't forget the importance of space-based assets in the context of stability and nuclear deterrence as well. So there was these 2-3 different factors that confluenced into this idea of treating space as a collective good, and this led to bilateral arms control treaties. It led to the Outer Space Treaty, and so on. But it wasn't, a linear, straightforward process. It was a process of learning through interaction between the Soviets and the Americans, right? There was nothing preordained, again, if you like, or deterministic about this. Today, where we are is that these lessons, in a way, have been unlearned. And add to these the mistrust, the lack of strategic dialogue between the Chinese and the Americans, with lots of things I would argue are more difficult because there is an ongoing war in Ukraine. But I think that great powers have the great power responsibility, if you like, to establish a framework for, I wouldn't call arms control, but what we call today setting a framework for avoiding conflict escalating. We're talking about China, also a nuclear weapon state, the US as well. Then there is a lot of discussion, if you're interested about this, about what we call the space nuclear entanglement, how you have commercial satellites now as part of nuclear deterrence. What happened if another country thinks it shut down a commercial satellite, but that satellite is part of the nuclear deterrence of another country, and then the second country thinks that the first country did that by launching a nuclear war. So there's so many things here that we have to take into consideration. But a first starting point would be not cooperation, but managing competition by establishing guardrails. And this will take some diplomatic imagination, some strategic imagination, and thinking about the box. But that's something that was done between the Soviets and the Americans during the Cold War. So by default, this shouldn't prevent this from happening today. I think that's one way to begin to think about that. And I'm saying that because there are many, many initiatives like the one mentioned in the context of the United Nations and the open-ended working group, where there was an effort to establish norms of responsible behavior in space. And this effort was derailed by Russians, for example. There is a lack of communication, a lack of strategic dialogue, different views, but at the same time, space, right? We all depend on space. And in this regard, it's very important for great space powers to assume great power responsibilities by establishing some guardrails to manage competition and draw some red lines about what is permissible and what is not. I mean, there's so many issues there that I can elaborate if you're interested. At the same time, diplomacy remains very important. There are many efforts. And then we shouldn't also, I talked a lot about the role of great space powers, but you know, we're also seeing the importance of non-state actors. So I think that's also very important, how you can incorporate private actors, non-state actors in efforts to establish collective, approaches to global challenges, such as the sustainability of space and space debris. So I think generally we are at the crossroads. And again, international relations theory has a lot to say about these global challenges. So I don't know if, Philip, I have addressed your question.
Thanks for the extensive analysis on the question. I think we have one more question in the chat from Kay. It's along the similar lines where they're asking about the 1967 OST. How likely are they to be implemented? Are there any efforts to update the 1967 OST?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the international legal framework that governs space activities, it hasn't been updated since the 70s, right? There was this plethora of diplomatic initiatives and efforts to establish this framework, and that was quite successful in the 60s and the 70s. Of course, the Outer Space Treaty epitomizes, it's the cornerstone of this legal framework. Very inspirational and aspirational, of course, and many principles look outdated, quite outdated today. The thing is, from an international politics perspective, that you have two important space actors, Russia and China, that they insist on legally binding international treaties. And then you have a majority of other countries, including the United States, European Union, European other players, India, in many ways, who are more keen for informal, non-binding frameworks, such as the one that was taking place within the United Nations, right? About establishing norms of responsible behavior. This is different from a formal, legally binding treaty. And there is a big gap there. Of course, the thing here is that this shouldn't be a mutually exclusive process, right? There's nothing that prevents us from establishing a normative framework, a framework of informal, non-binding treaties regarding, not treaties, a framework and an informal framework regarding, for example, guardrails, regarding norms about the sustainability of space, which is already happening in many ways. And then you as part of building blocks that can lead to a more formal treaty. But, how do you deal with that? Well, it goes back, I guess, to what I was saying before about the current political atmosphere. that is not conducive to updating treaties or even strategic dialogue. And that's why I think great powers have the responsibility to find ways for a mutual coexistence, if you like, in space. And at the same time, how do you try to incorporate non-state actors, private companies, because they already have a growing impact on the politics of space. Again, I think we are at the crossroads, and that's why international relations is very important.
Great.
sorry
Thank you,
for-
Dr.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
Sorry. Thanks a lot. I want to thank our speaker. I think that's it for the time we have. I guess we'll take a 10-minute break and start with the next session. Is there anything I'm missing? Anne, were you going to say something?
No, that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Okay,
very much.
thanks.
If you're
Thank you.
interested in the entry article I mentioned, feel free to drop me a line and I'm happy to share it with you. Thank you very
Will
much
do.
for your attention. Thank you,
Thank you
Kunal.
so much.
See you in the
Thanks.
next
Take
session.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye. See you later.